In this second part of the lecture revolving around the idea of the self, we're going to be going a little bit deeper in the topics of identity and personality. We have some context before we get started. As a reminder, in our last class, we spent a lot of time talking about this idea of something called the self. We talked about roughly what the self was, how different ages corresponded to different focuses on the self, and also how, as the self evolved, other ideas related to the self, like self esteem or self recognition, started to kind of evolve as well. We're going to narrow our focus in, as I mentioned before, on one critical aspect of the self in this first half of this lecture, this idea of something called our identity. Essentially, the identity, again, is the way we describe ourselves in the social world, essentially filling different niches or trying to find out which groups we can best align ourselves to. Now, the identity is a very multifaceted thing, and it's very unique for each individual as to kind of what they focus on in identities. But for most of us, when we talk about our identity, it's all about the commonalities we have with others, the things that we can say, I'm a part of, and this puts me into this grouping or this part of the population. Enough, when we look at our current view of identity, it's kind of different from one of the first theorists to really look at this concept of identity and developmental psychology. The first person is really credited with trying to form a framework of how identity shifts and changes as we grow was a theorist named Erik Erikson, who spent a lot of time actually working with Sigmund Freud at his Psychodynamic Institute over in Vienna, Austria. Erikson, as his career started to really unfold and kind of move in different directions, decided to try to kind of tap into this new idea that Freud and others had had of trying to kind of lay out a map for different elements of the mind and how we might focus on them and have issues with things based on some of the things that come up at different points in our life. And he thought, well, what better to study than kind of how we see ourselves situated in the social world, and more importantly, how we see the social world itself around us. So Erikson, after a lot of work, published this new theory that he called his stages of human development, which really revolved around this idea of identity and how we kind of see again the social world around us. In his mind, at each point in our life, we essentially had major identity questions that we were focusing on. And based on the conclusions we came to about those questions, the conclusions would carry over with us and impact our future interpretations of the social world and our future interpretations of our social roles in that world. He said for infants, their main focus is whether or not they can trust those around them. He said essentially all infants are testing out whether or not their parents are reliable, whether or not they have family members that can actually get them what they need. And by the time they get out of this infancy stage, and about one, he said, they come to this conclusion that they can either trust or they really can't trust the world. And based on this conclusion, they essentially carry that with them in future encounters where they'll be more or less trusting of people based on that first year of life. After that, he said they move into another stage. It starts around 1 and goes to around 3. He called it the toddler stage. Very appropriate name that you probably heard before coming into this class. And he argued that for these individuals, they're now focusing on whether or not they can do stuff on their own or they need to rely on others. And sense of independence versus a sense of dependence is essentially the way you want to look at this. If we're looking for kind of manifestations of this, you can see probably where Erikson got this idea. Many 2, 3-year-olds are obsessed with trying to do everything by themselves and feel very upset if they can't do something that they think they're going to be capable of doing. To Erikson, this was an indication that they were really struggling with this idea. And again, he was a firm believer in the fact that by the time we got to about 3, we'd come to a conclusion about our ability to be independent of others. And if we decided we needed to rely on others, well, then we had to carry this with us throughout our life. And if we decided that we were autonomous individuals capable of accomplishing things on our own, well, we got to carry that with us throughout our life. That didn't mean we were done. We said after we got to about three, we got into this new focus on what he called the initiative versus guilt focus, where we were asking, am I a good person or am I a bad person? How do people see me? Am I doing good things or bad things? And essentially, we'd gauge our level of goodness during this stage. And at that point, we started to worry about whether or not we were better or worse than individuals on some of the things that we were pursuing, what he called the industry versus inferiority focus. And he said this lasted actually all the way up until about adolescence, where we really are comparing ourselves to others and trying to figure out what makes us who we are. You notice a lot of this kind of overlaps with some of the self stuff that we were talking about in the previous class. The big difference here is it's a very strict focus on the social world in Erikson's idea, which is again the thing that separates out identity from this broad overarching idea of the self. Now, he said, like all the rest of them, once we get past around 12, we change our focus on whatever's next and just kind of keep track of all the decisions that we've made previously and carry those with us. But he said once we get into adolescence, a new obsession starts to come out, where we really do start to figure out our social niches, which groups we belong to, which things we like to associate ourselves with. And he said that really does stick with us once we get through adolescence for the rest of our lives. And he said very few people, once they get to the end part where they are messing a lot with their identity at this age, kind of change who they are after they're past the adolescent age. And instead, he said their main focus transitions to looking for a partner or whether or not we want to be alone. And then after we get into our late 20s, maybe early 30s, we start just trying to be productive members of society based on our decisions about who we are and whether or not we're going to be doing these things alone or with others. He said one last thing that people do focus on with respect to their identity as they get much older and into retirement age is whether or not they've lived a full life or failed. Essentially, he called this the ego integrity versus despair idea, where we do try to assess whether or not we can be proud of things that we've done or kind of regretful for the missed chances or the missed opportunities. That I don't necessarily want you to think of this idea and this roadmap that Erikson laid out as the penultimate concept of identity. But what it was a really interesting starting point. It take into the discussion of what we should be looking at when it comes to this idea of identity. Erikson's insistence that when we're in adolescence, we're hyper vigilant about what our identity in the social world is, seems to bear out in lots of research. In fact, we talked about this a lot when we're looking at the idea of the self. There's also this notion of identity focusing on past and current and future selves. It's something that, again, we talked about in previous classes that related more to research, proven things. But when we also look at some of the things that pop up with Erikson's ideas, there are some things that make people a little skeptical. One of the things that's probably an issue is that he did come to those conclusions that we kind of decide yes or no on certain things, or we're in one camp or another, and those things have to stay with us. We've talked before in previous lectures about how many psychologists aren't thrilled with these dichotomies, people being put into one group or another. And this is true when it comes to identity questions. Moreover, there's a lot of people that argue that these residual decisions that can't be unchanged don't seem to reflect what we see in lots of research. So in essence, if you had a rough go of things in your first year of life, it doesn't mean that you're going to forever not be able to trust anybody ever again. That's what most researchers kind of suggested as we've looked at this a little bit more closely. But we're looking for some really interesting things that have panned out from his work. It is that adolescence does seem to be a hyper-vigilant time looking at identity, and that when we're looking at identity realization, it does take us a long time to come to any conclusions, The catch is here that it's not like there's an endpoint like we saw in Erikson's work. And this brings us to what we look at with identity research today. When we look at identity research today, a lot of it's more built off of kind of the exploratory process, how we even think about our identity and try to pursue it. One of the first people to really suggest that this was a big feat that was approached differently with different people is a theorist named James Marshall, who talked about the four different ways that we could try to tackle our identity, not only in adolescence, but at multiple points in our life. He argued that for some individuals who had gone through this long journey and tried to figure out who they were and come out the other end achieving something called identity achievement. He said it's something that all of us should strive for because it makes us feel much more comfortable in who we are and not worried that maybe we kind of overshot or undershot that goal that we had. But he said many of us aren't quite there usually at any point in our life when it comes to certain aspects of our identity. Now, one thing he could be kind of looking for, we could be looking for, is this thing called identity moratorium, where we're pursuing identity, looking at different paths, looking at different options, but not necessarily committed to anything yet. Another thing that some kids and adults might settle on is this thing called identity foreclosure, where we just pick an identity, whichever one's closest to us or whichever one's kind of thrown in our lap, and we run with it, never questioning whether or not that was the right identity for us. Now, there is one other one that's out there. It's an odd one called identity diffusion, where essentially we just don't think about our identity. Instead of really going anywhere, we just kind of take things at face value and react without trying to really carve out a certain point where we fit. And Marshall's work, again, wasn't filled with tons of research. It was kind of like Erikson's in that it was more of an idea than something that was scientifically explored. But it did lead lots of people to start to look at this exploration process that we go through, when it goes through, and kind of we're looking for something that's very closely linked to this idea of identity. It's kind of our persistent behaviors within the social world. In fact, some people have argued that this idea of kind of pursuing identity goes hand in hand with us pursuing some type of personality. Enduring characteristics that we display across a multitude of social situations that people often call traits. What we tend to look at in identity and personality research is not necessarily what you're doing all the time in every social situation, but what you're doing most of the time, or which groups you're part of most of the time. If we focus on that most of the time idea, we can talk about personality being this thing that's fairly stable and something that theoretically should be carrying over across a wide range of situations. Now, there are lots of exceptions to this. Tons of research has shown that there is a huge cap on how much our personality characteristics are really impacting our behavior across a wide range of situations. But even if it's a lessened effect, many people over the years have tried to explore this idea of personality from a number of different perspectives. Research. One of the first big hurdles that needed to be tackled was how we actually can look at traits as researchers. Especially, how do we differentiate people was one of the major heated questions that was being asked. One of the first people to actually examine the idea of traits and actually come up with the concept of traits, a gentleman named Gordon Allport, spent a large portion of his career arguing that each person really has their own unique traits that if we want to use them to predict behaviors, we have to assess. He said, some people might have 8 traits that impact their social behaviors, while others might have 4 or 3 or whatever. This idea of Allport's was probably a little bit more spot on if we're looking at how people see themselves. But many personality psychologists argued that this belief that we had to treat everybody uniquely and that each person had to kind of figure out what made them tick is very problematic, much like some of the identity research that makes it tough to study as researchers. And that led a lot of trait psychologists to go down the path of trying to figure out if we could look more at what we call universal traits that we don't say people have or don't, but instead we measure how strong or weak these traits, universally applied traits, are in each individual. One of the first people to really champion this was a gentleman named Raymond Cattell, who actually, through lots of different scientific endeavors, came to conclude that people probably are best measured across 16 different dimensions. There was another researcher who kind of had a counter to this that I don't have listed here, named Hans Eysenck, who insisted that we probably only needed 3 traits. And for a long time, it was kind of a back and forth between people who thought we should really minimize the number of traits we measure in people and those that thought we needed to have a large number so we can really encapsulate everything that makes a person who they are. And eventually, it led toward a path that brought us to the resting place that we're currently at, where most personality psychologists tend to measure individuals along 5 distinct personality traits that we call the Big Five. It's not that all people have gone willingly down this path. In fact, some are still kicking and screaming, arguing that the Big Five is riddled with issues. But if you're looking at current research on personality, you'll usually see people using the Big Five. And this is something that's also been very successfully tied to developmental psychology over the last couple. If you haven't seen the Big Five before, I included them here on this slide. The Big Five are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. OCEAN, or what you'll sometimes hear people say, your personality spans the ocean. And again, what we do with the Big Five in personality psychology is we measure how high or low you are on these 5 different areas, each of them having actually 6 facets within them. So we can use your possession of these traits, either high or low or in the middle or whatever, to guess what you would do in situations related to it. For example, I might want to look at your levels of the Big Five to figure out who you'd be a good roommate with, or which major you might pursue. It's sort of linked to the idea of intelligence testing. It's just now we're looking more at your preferences and your behavioral things versus your aptitudes. And what lots of research has shown is that these things can have some predictive value and they can give us a little better sense of what somebody's like, but it's limited. It's not necessarily the best predictor of what you're going to do in lots of situations. It's usually the situation itself is not a bad starting point. And this is enough for many people in personality and developmental psychology to go on the path of looking at how we can tie the Big Five to a multitude of different things. One of the places that we've gone when looking at the Big Five in development is looking at how individuals change on their traits as they age. And what we've seen is that each person has their own ebbs and flows, even though we tend to become much more stable in our traits based on the measurements within the Big Five as we get older and older. There are, however, some kind of predictable trends that people tend to go down, even if it's not universal. As we get older, we tend to become less neurotic and also less open to experiences. Essentially, as we get more control over our environment, which we've talked about before with respect to the self, we tend to get bothered by things and upset by things less, and we tend to be more willing to try out new stuff. Now, I'm sure many of you right now are thinking about your grandparents or somebody that's older that you know who's gotten significantly more neurotic or upset as they get older and actually more willing to try new stuff. But overall, statistically, in terms of big term trends, what we've seen is that these things are fairly consistent, even though there will be individual differences. As we're going down in those, though, we do go up on 2 other traits. We tend to actually become more and more agreeable based on first parents' descriptions, other descriptions, and eventually our own descriptions throughout our entire life until pretty much the very end of our life. Now, most of the effect is usually seen when we transition from childhood into adulthood. In reality, nobody's really that agreeable on the scale of 1 to 7 in the agreeableness measurements in the big five when they're young. It does mean that average is actually still probably going to stay the same for each group. It's just, well, the average for 2-year-olds on a scale of 1 to 7 might be somewhere around a 2 or a 3. And when we get to 16, 17, it might suddenly drop up to a 3 or a 4. And when we get up into our 40s, maybe even a 4 or a 5. Just kind of how those things work with trends changing and averages having to adjust for different ages. Same thing works with conscientiousness. It's just here what we tend to see is we tend to be at a relatively set level of conscientiousness until we get into about middle age, in which case we tend to uptick just a little bit past that point. And all these trends really show us not necessarily how personality is being shifted, but how we can reliably expect certain shifts in personality to happen. Look for the cause of these things. What we've seen is there's probably a lot of sources to them. What we noticed in numerous studies where we've compared different cultures and different generations is that social movements and things going on in society can greatly impact the trends and the averages within different groups. It's probably not just random chance that as people get into college and beyond, there's usually an uptick in conscientiousness levels, possibly because we're only measuring a certain subset of the population at that point, but also because probably we're pushed a little bit more to become more conscientious as we get into college and as we get beyond and have more responsibilities and things to think about. It's also true that if, say, everybody's attention is turned to something for a while, it can shift everybody's behaviors and things that reflect personality. Historically, the classical example of this was the Great Depression, where there was lots of research that showed that neuroticism levels of people who grew up during the Depression and conscientiousness levels of those individuals were significantly higher than the rest of the population. Nowadays, one of the hot topics is looking at how the coronavirus outbreak could be potentially shifting many of today's children in ways that we're not even aware of when it comes to things like agreeableness levels and extroversion levels and other things that are really untapped yet, but should actually be impacted by something as kind of worldwide as the coronavirus outbreak has been. In terms of other things that are kind of neat, we've also seen that cell phone generations tend to make our current generation, people going through high school and college, significantly more extroverted and open to experience versus almost any other previous generation out there. Oddly enough, and I don't have this mentioned here, it also seems to be impacting agreeableness levels in what maybe is considered slightly less desirable ways, where the current generations passing through our high schools and colleges right now have been labeled as the least trusting, least agreeable generation ever. That's probably a slight over exaggeration. We tend to do this when comparing generations, but it's no doubt that when we ask people how much they trust others, how agreeable they are through the surveys, that we are getting less and less agreeable as we're moving more and more to things like distance education and other areas where people aren't seeing a lot of individuals face to face. And all this really shows, again, how we can talk about how traits are impacting us at different points, but we also have to recognize the social impact that our environment and things going on can have on the traits that we end up manifesting. Another thing that's really interesting to note is that even though most researchers have focused their attention on the big five and how it shifts throughout life, some kind of outside in thinkers have come back to the question of whether or not the big five works when we start getting into different age groups. To understand this debate, we have to understand where the big five originally came from, something that I'm not going to bore you with too much. So essentially understand that the big five came from this big mathematical modeling approach called the factor analysis, where once researchers had come up with an extensive list of things that could potentially be traits we use to define ourselves, They asked people to rate themselves on the exhaustive list and looked for correlational overlaps between things that could be chunked into a couple different categories. That's where we got the big five. What researchers decided to do once we started looking at the overlap between the development and big five is not just look at how it shifted, but whether or not the factor analysis approach that we used to get to the big five would get us to the same results if we looked at younger individuals. And one of the first studies to do this was this very classic study that tapped into something that was very popular in the late 90s, movie series that you might have seen, and book series as well, called Harry Potter. I'm guessing some of you are giggling a little bit because you might remember being younger at about this time and obsessing about which Harry Potter character you were most like or which house you belonged to and whether or not Hogwarts actually existed. Well, some very ingenious researchers over at Harvard and even at Berkeley came to the conclusion that they could take advantage of this obsession, give kids kind of some information that would be fun, and also run a really big scale factor analysis just by having parents and kids log in and answer a whole bunch of questions about themselves so they could figure out which Harry Potter character they were most like, and more importantly for the researchers, so they could run these factor analyses on a slew of different trait-based questions so they could see if the big five emerged. Now, you probably don't remember doing this. Maybe some of you did. It's still possible that some of you did this. But when these researchers ran this study, they got not just a couple thousand participants, but hundreds of thousands of participants. In fact, I think they reached the million mark at some point. It was an egregious amount of people going onto these sites and answering these questions. And researchers in this study knew that there were probably multiple people taking the survey multiple times, but that actually wasn't a problem. What they wanted to do was, again, look for trends, overlaps in traits that people kind of inherently saw as matching. And when they did the factor analysis for this just exhaustive list of responses, they found something really surprising. They found what they labeled the big seven. The big five were there. The five traits we've talked about: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. But there were two extra ones that emerged. It's called sociability and activity levels. Sociability essentially is how talkative a child is, and activity levels is how, well, active the child is. Essentially, sociability very closely relates to extroversion when we look at adults, and activity levels very closely relates to openness to experience when we look at adults. For kids, those things don't necessarily have to go hand in hand. There are many kids who are high in sociability, love to talk, but aren't necessarily extremely extroverted. Just like a very select few individuals that they can be around, or maybe just like being alone while they talk constantly. It's also the reverse, ones that love being around people that don't talk much. Now, it's not that these things are counter to each other for kids, it's just they don't necessarily have to correlate with each other like they typically do for adults. Same thing with activity levels. You can have very inactive kids that like trying new stuff and very active kids that just like routine. So those things don't have to go hand in hand like we see with adults. And because of this discovery, it led lots of researchers to take a step back and think about how universal these universal traits were and what we should measure and talk about when these condense at different ages. And it also led other researchers to recognize that maybe this hypervigilance on early adulthood, maybe late adolescence, has allowed us to miss not only what happened with children, but also what happens when we get into the latter years of our life. What the factor analysis we've done with elderly individuals suggests, since we found the big seven in children, is that we probably need to talk when we're looking at elderly individuals about what's called the big three. And that's because essentially openness to experience, extroversion, and neuroticism, those three different traits, kind of condense into just one thing, one big type of extroversion is what people usually talk about. And then you've got that big type of extroversion paired up with agreeableness and agreeableness and conscientiousness. the big three: extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. An odd pairing, but it's one that we've used to study kind of, again, how people shift and certain things that we can correlate these big traits with. It's given us some really interesting insights as to who might match up better with others when they get into certain points in their life, and which things we might need to focus on when looking at different aspects of where we are in life. I have an interesting inside-out way of tying development to personality, where we usually just apply personality concepts to development, but in this case, we're applying development concepts to personality research. Another thing that we've started to look at with respect to kind of the overlap between personality and development is the different life events that seem to be playing roles in shifts, dramatic or minor, in the personality that people display. There's been numerous studies that have shown that even though our traits are fairly consistent, as we talked about, when we look at the exceptions to that consistency, it's usually revolving around things that happen to us at certain points in our life. Many studies have shown that, as we talked about before, upticks in schooling or financial issues can have an impact on our conscientiousness levels. Same thing with neuroticism and the introduction of children into our lives, or deaths of loved ones, or losses of things that we had, either financially or kind of emotionally. Those things can definitely shift us in not necessarily gigantic ways, but noticeable ways that do shift the scales in different directions. And it's led researchers to look at different cultures and when things happen and how that might give us a better understanding of why certain groups might not respond the same way to some of these trait measures. It also really gives us this kind of recognition that there's a back and forth between our personality impacting our behaviors at different points in our life and different points in our life impacting our personality. Again, gives us a very holistic perspective on this idea of traits and development. This is going to be where we're going to close out this module. I know we didn't go through quite as much as we've done in previous modules, but there's some really important things that are in this set of presentations. There's also some really cool stuff in the readings. So I encourage you, so you can better understand this idea of the self and how we describe who we are, and how we can break up the self from identity and personality, to kind of read through the book so you really get at the core material here. And once you're done with that, make sure you get working on everything that you need to do. And I will see most of you when we get to our very next module. In case you're wondering, is going to be on gender and sexual identity development. This is a fairly sensitive topic that is definitely going to put many people on edge, especially as we're dealing with some of the things in our current society that we're dealing with. And I promise I'm going to try to be as balanced as I can when looking at these ideas from both the scientific but also kind of the social perspective. It's also why in this next module, we're not going to have 2 lectures. We're actually just going to have 1. It's a little bit longer than most of the ones that you've been encountering lately. Because in that one, we're going to focus more on kind of the research side of things. And then we're going to explore in the second part of it a video that really does highlight how a lot of research might have missed a major component when it comes to gender and sexual development. So I encourage you to be ready to tackle a lot of stuff in the next module, and hopefully you can tackle it with an open mind, because that will really help enhance your ability to get the most from that section. For now though, take care, and I'll see you soon.